The United States government shut down at 12:01 a.m. ET on October 1st, 2025. Now, for those of us who've followed Washington politics, the typical narrative starts playing out in your head, right? Temporary pain, weeks of grandstanding, eventually some compromise, and, crucially, everyone gets back pay.
Right. That's the standard playbook.
But stop that narrative right there. This 2025 shutdown, it feels fundamentally different. Our sources suggest it is not a temporary pause they're trying to resolve.
No, it seems it's being actively strategically leveraged, used as a tool for, well, permanent mass layoffs and a really radical, potentially irreversible restructuring of the federal bureaucracy.
The cost is just staggering.
What's fascinating here, I think, is that the economic cost is estimated around $400 million per day, and that's just in lost federal worker compensation alone.
Wow.
Yeah. And despite that massive bleed, this event isn't really being treated by one side as a failure to be solved. It's more like an opportunity, a crucial lever they plan to pull.
Okay, let's unpack this then. You sent us these sources detailing the political breakdown, but more importantly, this unprecedented executive directive that followed. This wasn't about avoiding a crisis. It sounds like it was about weaponizing it.
Exactly.
So our mission today is to dig into the intent behind this, the mechanics of the strategy, and, of course, the widespread human and economic toll of what sounds like a really radical departure from precedent.
We should probably just quickly establish the immediate facts. So the full U.S. government shutdown started after Congress failed to pass the necessary appropriations bill.
The funding bills, yeah.
Right. And that immediately furloughed, an estimated 750,000 federal employees? But we really need to move beyond just those surface facts pretty quickly.
Because the question isn't just that it happened, but maybe why they let it happen.
Precisely.
So the political conflict that led to the midnight deadline failure hinged, as it often does, on the expiration of the fiscal year's legal spending authority, September 30th.
Yep, the end of the fiscal year.
And we know the key procedural failure happened in the Senate.
Yes. The Senate failed to advance a short-term funding proposal, a continuing resolution, or CR, because it needed 60 votes to overcome a filibuster, and it failed on a 55-45 vote.
So even with unified Republican-controlled White House, both chambers of Congress, the Democratic minority still had that blocking power.
It demonstrates that potent blocking power, absolutely. It forced a crisis even with that unified control.
Okay, so what was the specific legislative sticking point, the poison pill, so to speak? Sounds like it came down to health care.
Yeah, the deadlock really centered on healthcare. The Democratic demand was focused on making permanent the enhanced tax credits for the Affordable Care Act subsidies.
ACA subsidies. Sure.
Which were apparently critical for about 20 million Americans and were set to expire. They also wanted to reverse some prior Medicaid cuts.
And the Republican position?
They rejected that. They insisted on a clean continuing resolution, arguing, major policy changes shouldn't be attached to temporary funding.
Okay, so far so familiar, maybe. Then we saw the predictable blame game kick in.
Oh, immediately. The administration, using official communications, OMB, even agency websites like HUD, quickly pointed the finger at Democrats' insane policy demands and the radical left for the shutdown.
And the Democrats fired back, saying the administration was plunging America into a shutdown, risking health care, predicting the public would blame the president. Standard stuff.
But this public hostility, this sort of signaling from the administration showing a clear preference for conflict over trying to find some middle ground, that was maybe the critical sign this time.
How so?
Well, look, legislative failures happen all the time in Washington, right? But this time, it felt like the executive branch was almost waiting for that failure. Like they weren't scrambling to compromise. They were strategically preparing to activate a plan B the moment funding lapsed.
Okay, so this is the critical moment you're pointing to. This whole conflict quickly shifted from just a legislative failure, a funding gap, to an executive strategy.
Exactly. The collapse of the funding deadline wasn't seen, at least by the administration, according to these sources, as a disaster to be fixed. It was framed as a political opportunity.
And the president's own rhetoric shifted immediately, framing the shutdown not as some kind of government failure, but as a chance for getting rid of Democrat things and achieving irreversible consequences, explicitly including permanent layoffs.
Yeah, that's what we mean by goal inversion. The shutdown itself becomes part of the goal.
So that rhetoric then paved the way for the formal blueprint, this OMB memo that came out shortly before the deadline actually hit.
Right. And this document, this memo, is really the cornerstone of this weaponization strategy we're talking about, because it tells federal agencies essentially to move beyond temporary furloughs
Beyond furloughs.
and use this opportunity, that's the language, to consider reduction in force RAF notices.
Okay, wait. RIFs, reduction in force. I mean, isn't that a standard legal process for downsizing?
Yeah.
Agencies use it sometimes, right? What makes this different?
It is a formal process for permanent layoffs, yes. It eliminates positions entirely. But the sources detail how this OMB memo specifically directs agencies to identify programs for elimination using 3 criteria.
Okay.
But it emphasizes the third criterion. Programs must be identified as not consistent with the president's priorities.
Not consistent with the president's priorities. That's the bombshell.
That's the core of it.
Because that explicitly politicizes the whole process, doesn't it? It seems to give agencies a mandate to just dismantle programs based on whether they align ideologically with the current administration's agenda.
Precisely. And critics argue that this fundamentally undermines the whole idea of a nonpartisan, merit-based civil service. You know, the bedrock principle.
Right, because if your job security suddenly depends on the current administration's ideology.
Then you're effectively transforming permanent government employees into something more like politically vulnerable appointees. Which, well, it raises immediate questions about those neutrality standards the civil service is supposed to be built on.
Let's clearly contrast this RIF strategy with historical shutdowns, because I think this is where you, listening, really need to grasp the magnitude of the change. Every shutdown I remember, maybe you remember, used furloughs.
That's the key difference. Furloughs are temporary. It's a non-pay status, yes, but critically, under a 2019 law, the Government Employee Fair Treatment Act, furloughed workers are legally guaranteed retroactive back pay.
So there's a floor there. Some security, some predictability, even if it's painful short-term.
Exactly. The 2025 RIF directive just shatters that precedent. It transforms what was usually a temporary financial hardship into a potential permanent workforce reduction. And even official communications described it as a much more aggressive step.
And connecting this to the bigger picture, this aggressive strategy seems directly linked to that broader conservative playbook, often called Project 2025.
Yes, allies of the administration have been quite explicit about it, according to the materials. They see the shutdown as the necessary opportunity, that word again needed to, quote, call the herd of the federal regulatory agencies.
Cull the herd.
And achieve a smaller government that maybe they couldn't get through the normal legislative budget process. The goal, as described in these sources, is to make the entire administrative state responsive, mainly to the executive branch.
So when we talk about this OMB memo and RIFs, we're not just talking abstract policy points. We're talking who gets hit immediately. Let's look at the numbers again.
Yeah, the human cost.
We're talking, what, 750,000 up to maybe 900,000 federal employees immediately furloughed. Plus, you've got essential workers, 2 million military personnel, law enforcement, air traffic controllers. They have to work, but without getting paid.
And the human toll here isn't just, a skipped paycheck, though that's hard enough. It's potential institutional trauma.
How do you mean?
Well, think about a career public servant, maybe an FDA inspector, an environmental scientist, someone who's dedicated 20 years to what they see as nonpartisan service. And suddenly they're facing a pink slip, not because of performance, but because their program isn't deemed consistent with priorities.
Right. The financial hardship is one thing, but now it's compounded by the fear of permanent job loss.
Exactly. And that anxiety, it spreads. It forces not just the furloughed employees, but potentially the entire federal and contractor workforce to start thinking about deep precautionary savings.
Because they don't know if they're next or if the whole system is changing.
Right. And when people panic about their long-term security, they stop spending. That suppresses economic demand, potentially even after the shutdown technically ends.
And you mentioned contractors. That seems like a particularly vulnerable group here.
Extremely vulnerable. The financial precarity is maybe most acute for them. We're talking millions of private sector workers whose companies contract with the government, maybe 4.1 million people.
And unlike direct federal employees,
they have zero legal recourse for back pay. None. Their income loss is permanent. And this uncertainty, this RIF threat, it just poisons the entire job market that services the federal government.
Beyond the individuals, the macroeconomic shockwaves seem immediate and, well, global even.
They are. Forecasters started projecting reduced GDP growth pretty quickly, something like zero point 0.1 to zero point 0.2 percentage points shaved off for each week this thing continues.
That adds up fast.
It really does. And we saw financial markets react strongly. Gold prices surged to a record high, what was it, $3,895 an ounce? Investors running for safety amid the chaos.
And that chaos is amplified by just paralysis, right?
Policy paralysis, yeah. Critical data needed for decision-making just stops flowing. Think about the halt in crucial economic releases, like the September jobs report from the Bureau of Labor Statistics.
So investors, the Federal Reserve, they're flying blind.
Essentially in the dark, yeah, regarding really crucial monetary policy decisions at a potentially fragile time.
Meanwhile, day-to-day services people rely on just vanish. The sources mentioned immediate suspension of routine FDA food inspections, environmental safety checks,
Which obviously increases public health risks the longer it goes on.
and travel. Tourism industry projecting huge losses. People canceling flights fearing delays like we saw in the 2018-19 shutdown.
Yeah, billions potentially lost weekly in tourism alone. And we can't forget the social safety net stuff.
Right. Social Security, Medicare payments continue. That's important to note.
The checks still go out, yes. But critical processes like handling new claims, they stall. And programs like WIC Vital Nutrition Assistance for vulnerable women and kids, they face a really rapid depletion of funds. That cuts off immediate support for people who desperately need it.
Okay, so to really place this 2025 event in context, let's hammer home the two major distinguishing factors you've highlighted. First, the political alignment.
Yes, this is the first major shutdown, according to the analysis, to occur under a unified government, meaning the president and both chambers of Congress are controlled by the same party.
Which is counterintuitive, right? Usually you'd think unified government means easier funding.
Exactly. Previous big shutdowns in 95, 96, 2013, 2018, 19 were almost always legislative battles between parties, aimed at forcing compromise from the opposing side.
Which brings us to the second factor, the goal inversion.
Right. The 2025 shutdown, as presented in these sources, isn't primarily a legislative tool to extract concessions. It's an administrative strategy. The condition of the shutdown becomes the desired outcome because it allows the executive branch to bypass Congress, arguably, and implement permanent policy change through these RIFs.
So what does this mean long term? If this strategy holds, what are the consequences for the civil service itself?
Well, the sources argue it means federal employment becomes fundamentally politicized. Job security gets tied not to competence or merit, but explicitly to the president's priorities, whatever those may be at the time.
Which must create a chilling effect.
A profound chilling effect, likely triggering an exodus. You could see experienced workers, the people who hold the institutional memory of federal agencies, just deciding to retire or resign rather than face that uncertainty.
And recruitment, trying to attract top talent.
It severely damages the government's ability to recruit talented individuals in the future. Why would someone choose a career path that could be abruptly terminated based on the outcome of the next election? You're potentially looking at a less capable, less expert federal government down the line.
It sounds like the argument is the government is actively seeking to degrade its own capacity for nonpartisan expertise.
That's certainly one interpretation presented. And finally, there's the erosion of norms aspect.
Right. Using a temporary funding lapse to achieve a massive policy goal like downsizing the government.
It arguably hijacks the appropriations process, which is Congress's job. That sets an incredibly dangerous precedent, potentially, for future administrations, regardless of which party is in power.
And the partisan communication aspect, using official channels for political attacks.
Moreover, yeah, the administration's use of official government communications for these partisan attacks that blurs the lines. It potentially undermines the neutrality and integrity of federal institutions themselves, eroding public trust that these agencies serve the public, not just the party currently in charge. Hashtag tag outro.
Okay, so to try and synthesize the central thesis of our deep dive today, based on these materials, the 2025 shutdown isn't being treated as just a failed negotiation. It appears to be the deliberate execution of an ideological plan.
A plan to permanently restructure the administrative state, using the RIF mechanism as the key tool.
A strategic purge, maybe, masquerading as a funding lapse.
That seems to be the core argument we've explored, and it raises a really important question, I think, for you, the listener, to consider going forward.
Yeah.
If a shutdown is no longer a mutually painful crisis that inevitably pressures all sides toward compromise, but instead it's seen as a strategic opportunity for one side to enact its agenda unilaterally, Well, can the congressional appropriations process even continue to function as a viable mechanism for governing in the future? This kind of structural change, if it takes hold, might permanently alter the entire landscape of U.S. fiscal policy and governance.
A provocative thought indeed. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the sources defining the 2025 civil service shakeup. We'll catch you next time.